Hello and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me in the studio this week we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on today's show, the downfall of Nicola Sturgeon, the killing of Brianna Ghey, and the unrest in Knowsley. So, Nicola Sturgeon has resigned after 8 years as First Minister of Scotland. She said in her resignation speech that she'd essentially run out of energy. She doesn't want to subject her family to the pressures of political life anymore. And she was pretty adamant that this had nothing to do with any, what she called short-term pressures. Now, Tom, do you buy that? I mean, there were some pretty serious short-term pressures on her, namely the gender row.
No, I think that speech was an incredible act of kind of obfuscation and, essentially trying to play the victim as well, really. But I think the idea that this had nothing to do with what she euphemistically called the short-term pressures, but really were the whole debacle over her gender bill, which had seen her authority unravelling for a matter of weeks now, is ridiculous. It's quite clearly the thing that, whilst there are many factors, there are many things that were leading her to kind of run out of road in various different respects. I think her general political project in all sorts of ways was like colliding with political reality as well as just general common sense. But this was certainly the most significant thing in recent weeks. And I don't think that should be downplayed. Obviously, I'm sure we'll get into the question of what this means for independence, about what it means for the SNP, about what that means for British politics more broadly. But the idea that this was some sort of frippery, that it was just the straw that broke the camel's back, I don't think appreciates how significant this particular row was. I mean, row is a kind word for it. I mean, the way in which it not only, I think, kind of destroyed any claim she might have had to being a kind of progressive political leader as far as shredding women's rights, again, denouncing any critics as just kind of bigots who shouldn't be listened to, but also it just looked crazed. I think in the figure of someone like Nicola Sturgeon, you really see, particularly by dint of this embrace of woke ideology more broadly, that despite all this claims that they're the sensible people, they're the adults in the room, they're actually wedded to some incredibly batty and damaging ideas. And I think this is one of those things which really just exploded any claim she had to being a kind of credible political figure as much as anything else, as well as just showing how big the gap was between her in particular, but the Scottish political ruling class more broadly, and ordinary Scottish people who have reacted very strongly to these reforms ever since they first learnt about them, really.
Definitely. So there's a clip I want to show now, which I think is where we can really pinpoint the exact moment that it all fell apart, where she essentially struggles to say whether a man who raped 2 women is a man or a woman.
Trans women are women, but in the prison context, there is no automatic right for a trans woman.
So there are contexts where a trans woman is not a woman?
No, there is circumstances in which a trans woman will be housed in the male prison estate.
Is there any context in which a woman born as a woman will be housed in the male estate?
Look, we're talking here about trans women.
And I'm now asking about women born as women.
I don't think there are circumstances there, but...
So it's different for trans women?
Well, yes, and I'm not...
So there, Ella, we have someone, Nicola Sturgeon was such a kind of canny operator, never lost for words. They're, stumbling over what should be the most basic question in the world. Is this man a man or is he a woman?
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to Alex Salmond on the radio, who, might be a little bit biased in his assessment of Nicola Sturgeon, but certainly knows her very well. And he made the point that the sort of so much of her success is that she is such a clear communicator. She was never tripped up. She was extremely confident, and she's just been rendered a sort of blabbering mess in relation to this whole row over gender. I mean, it's really important as well that towards the latter stages of the last few weeks, she didn't even have the confidence to defend her own position because of the fact that we were talking about such an obvious case of a man raping 2 women, that she then couldn't, describe and be confident in her own idea of gender ideology and self-ID and all that sort of thing. So she just basically said nothing. And I think everybody knows that that's quite a significant reason of why she's resigning. But also I think, it's important to note the sort of failure of the dream of independence, which is that she not so long ago said that the next Westminster election was going to be a referendum on independence. It was all, guns blazing, and it's pretty clear to everyone now that is, if she did carry on with that line, that it was going to be incredibly embarrassing. So I think it looks to most people like a sort of a cowardly exit. We're all human. We understand that, okay, like she said, she's 53, been in politics for, decades, might be sick and tired of it. But at this moment, it seems like a strange moment. And, it's been pretty sick-making listening and reading all the sort of tributes, the delusional tributes actually, from some people about, number one, why Nicola Sturgeon's such a inspiration to women and girls. Like you said, like Tom says,
doesn't know what a woman is.
Yeah, completely ignoring as Tom says, the shredding of women's rights that she's just been engaged in the last, for the last few months. But also that she was such a successful politician. This is the leader of the SNP that has been routinely unsuccessful in terms of, the Scottish healthcare system, in terms of passing legislation. It's the SNP have a list as long as your arm of failed and bad legislation, from the named person scheme to the gender reform bill more recently. So, just because somebody's in a position for a long time doesn't make them a successful politician.
One thing those kind of commentators, those sort of centrist commentators, are bought into is this idea that she's compassionate, that she cares about the people of Scotland. But Tom, doesn't her record really say otherwise?
Of course it does. And not just on the gender questions. I think it's interesting. I think that some of the kind of plaudits, obviously Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP more broadly have dominated Scottish politics for a very long time now.
Yeah.
It's kind of signal achievement. It's been more or less a one-party state for so long, which at this point has led to all kinds of scandals building up, which of course has been impacted upon her particular decision. I'm sure there's some things coming down the track which are probably going to bite as well. But there was also in the kind of, but as Ella was saying, also what are these kind of great progressive success stories that they want to point to? Because not only do you have, obviously people hold up the gender recognition bill, but if you think that's progressive, then you need your head examining as far as I'm concerned. There was also just their general treatment of who would traditionally be considered the progressive constituency. Ordinary people, working class people, were basically always treated as a problem to be managed by the SNP. Their embrace of every kind of authoritarian wheeze going. If you're talking about the hate crime bill, criminalising even dinner table conversations, this is before Nicola Sturgeon's time, but one of the most shocking and kind of first things the SNP did when they came to power was pass laws that allowed them to lock up offensive football fans and things like this. Let alone the kind of name person scheme, which a lot of people have forgotten about now because it was thankfully defeated. But this attempt to introduce a kind of state guardian for every child in Scotland, which again kind of projects a complete contempt for ordinary people. And then also, if you think about the things that the Guardian or the Observer might care about, Nicola Sturgeon made things like closing the educational attainment gap between rich and poor in Scotland one of her key tests. And it's as wide as it's ever been. Life expectancy is dropping at historic rates at the moment. The Scottish NHS is even worse than it is in England and so on. So I think in so many ways, the plaudits speak to the fact that amongst the kind of liberal left in general, they really do sort of practice, you could call it politics as vibes, as people do on the internet, as far as because they just present themselves as cuddly and progressive. That's good enough for them, regardless of what the actual policy outcomes are.
She's kind of a Jacinda figure.
It's exactly like Jacinda,
Very similar in that respect. But then also, if you kind of look at it a different way, in a sense, it's like the reason they appreciate her is because she was a figure in the culture war, the anti-Brexit culture war, the gender culture war, and so on. So even though they might, and even in her speech, she kind of implied that she was partly brought down because there are all these kind of divisive culture warriors out there who want to caricature her. In a weird sort of sense, I think the reason she was held up so much is less for what it is that she was supposed to set out to achieve. Because if you're talking about independence, gender reform, or anything else, a lot of that lies in tatters at this point. But her significance as a kind of, in a sense, as a culture war figure in Britain was almost what cemented it for her.
We should talk a bit about that, the sort of hollowness of, I guess, the Scottish independence push, because it did just seem like a culture war against England or a kind of culture war against
Brexit
against Brexit and the English Tories and things like that. There wasn't really any kind of democratic substance. It wasn't really a push for sovereignty in any meaningful sense, as far as I can tell.
Well, yeah, most, I think even people who are sort of fervently pro-Scottish independence will admit that a large part of that sort of that vote and that political view is an anti-Westminster view. It's a kind of a negative way of looking at it, which is we hate Westminster. There's a little bit of anti-English sort of stuff thrown in there, and certainly a lot of kind of at the time when he was Prime Minister, anti-Boris stuff, which if you strip it away, and actually if if Scotland did vote to be independent, what would be left in terms of the positive vote for independence would be very little. And that's why they lean on, relationships with the European Union. Everybody knows that European Union is sort of like, don't place your bets on us because it's not certain that we're going to let you in. That's the kind of an awkward situation for, I'm sure Nicola Sturgeon and people recognise, which is that nothing's certain in relation to that.
Well, you wouldn't want to be in an independent. You'd immediately give away your independence. Suddenly.
Yeah, but the thing is that doesn't seem. It's the Scottish independence row is interesting because it doesn't seem to, because of the sort of delusions around Brexit and the fact that hardcore anti-Brexit Remainers like Nicola Sturgeon can't get their head around the concept of sovereignty or the concept of why independence in relation to trades, laws, borders would be a good thing. They can't see the contradiction in arguing for a sovereign state and independence and freedom and Braveheart and all that kind of stuff, and then at the same time signing up to give that all away to the European Union. But I think it will be interesting to see who's going to be able to come in and fill her shoes, because so much of the two figures who sort of stood for Scottish independence was Alex Salmond, who's now semi-disgraced and in his own sort of party, and Nicola Sturgeon, and with the two of them sort of out of the picture in different ways. There's no, the list of people that are being touted in sort of the columns and reporting over the last 24 hours. Most of them, you're like, who? Who's that?
I think the top candidate's got about 7% support among SNP members. Good luck to her.
Yeah, I'm sure the don't know is probably racing ahead at this point in terms of the sort of polling. But it is striking how independence, despite the kind of SNP dominance of Scottish politics, both in Holyrood and Westminster for a long time now, the failure of it on a kind of just a basic political and strategy level, so when they lose the referendum in 2014, although they make up a lot of ground that people that are very complacent, stay-in campaign didn't really think was going to happen. They lose 45-55. I mean, the huge poll by Lord Ashcroft the other week found that the numbers, if anything, have edged up in favour of the union, not by much, by about 1 percentage point, but still, over all of that time, and with the gift of what they thought was the gift of Brexit, the gift of Boris Johnson in number 10 Downing Street, they've categorically failed to be able to kind of move the dial on this particular question. And also every kind of attempt to try and carve out that second referendum, Nicola Sturgeon's a big fan of second referendums, as we know, has just completely failed. So obviously you had her attempt to kind of just legislate for one, not backed by the Supreme Court in pretty humiliating fashion, not least because they tried to mount it on this historically illiterate basis that they were basically a kind of oppressed colony, which was mocked and derided and so on. And then, as Ella was talking about, this attempt to just say the next election is going to be a de facto referendum. About a fifth of Scots support that particular plan. And so on that kind of political strategic level, which is completely blown up in her face. But then also the more important thing, as you've both been talking about, is the fact that, what is independence for if you want to go and join the European Union? Just it basically became a campaign to join an empire rather than leave one, as far as they were concerned. And then also a lot of the other stuff that we're talking about, this is supposed to be, or should, you would think, be a movement for popular sovereignty amongst Scots. They don't trust Scots to feed their own children unguided. Why would you trust them to steer their nation? So that contradiction, it was always going to kind of show itself, and I think it has. And it's not to say that people should be complacent about the union. I think one thing that was shown with the independence vote, as well as the kind of battles over gender, a lot of woke issues or whatever, is that the old establishment, the kind of Great British wide establishment, if you like, have proven themselves completely incapable of pushing back against these poisonous new elites, if you like. We saw that with the Scottish independence movement. I think we saw that with wokeness more broadly as well. So nothing, no one can be complacent about that. But I think it's certainly fair to say that in her leaving the stage, it's been a significant blow to that independence movement, because it represents a kind of significant defeat for any attempt to make that happen, not least because, as I say, it was all the kind of timbers of it were rotten to begin with, I think, in so many ways.
Well, the irony is that, of course, towards the end, she found something an independent Scotland would be able to do, not inside the United Kingdom, which is let people change their gender at age 16 by self-declaration alone. Turns out Scots don't actually want that, which, again, demonstrates her sort of lack of strategic nous. I think she thought that she could make a kind of anti-Westminster culture war out of that, rather than, Scots saying, No thanks. Thank you, Rishi Sunak, for blocking this crazy bill.
That is mad when you think about it. She thought that issue would drive a wedge between Westminster and Scots. The precise opposite happened. In blocking that bill, it, if anything, drove more of a wedge between Scots and Nicola Sturgeon. Aside from the rights and wrongs, I think the presentation of that Section 35 order as this is trying to thwart the will of the Scottish people, when obviously it was about this bill having a knock-on impact across GB and etc. But still,
yeah.
And even, again, all the kind of commentators down south being, this will only blow up for Rishi Sunak. Once again, a lot of bad takes are being, re-aired now.
One thing I love about Wondrium is that you can really dig deep into a subject. A lot of its programs are led by a subject matter expert, and they can deliver hours worth of knowledge on their specialist subject. But as well as that, Wondrium has some brilliant documentaries on offer too. You'll learn just as much, but in a slightly different format. One Wondrium series I've really been getting into lately is The Real Ancient Egypt. Over 9 30-minute episodes, you'll hear from 4 top Egyptologists, and they talk about their latest discoveries in this incredibly fascinating field. So it turns out that even today, we're still discovering new things about the life of King Tutankhamun, and we're still grappling with what ancient Egyptians really thought about death and the afterlife. The Real Ancient Egypt dispels a lot of key myths as well, and it's really got me thinking about how history is hardly ever truly settled in the way we often think it is. To top it all off, the series is beautifully presented and put together. Plus, it's just one of the many excellent series that's available to download or stream on Wondrium. Wondrium is my favourite educational platform. It's got documentaries, series, lessons, how-to guides, and more on just about every subject imaginable. I really can't recommend signing up to Wondrium enough. There's a huge selection of videos. There's over 8,000 hours worth of content. You've got the flexibility to switch to audio only, which is great for learning on the go or when multitasking. The quality of the content is superb as well. The programs are expert-led, they're easy to follow, and they're beautifully filmed. I can watch or listen on my phone, tablet, TV, or computer, so it's pretty much accessible from anywhere. And there's no adverts in between programs and no tests at the end, so you can enjoy learning with no interruptions and no stress. So, learn about what you love and love learning about with Wondrium. Do what I did and sign up for Wondrium now. And right now, Spiked podcast listeners and viewers can get 2 years of Wondrium for the price of 1. It's a fantastic deal, but it's only available if you sign up through our special URL. Just go to wondrium.com/spiked. That's wondrium.com/spiked. Wondrium.com/spiked. A transgender teenager was found dead in a park in Warrington on Saturday. 16-year-old Brianna Ghey was stabbed to death. 2 suspects have been arrested, both 15, a boy and a girl, in connection to the killing. Quite quickly, this tragedy was leapt on, weaponized, I think it's fair to say. There have been vigils come protests. Immediately it's been folded into the culture wars, and pretty much anyone apart from the suspects, it seems, is to blame for this death if you go by what's being written on Twitter. Tom, what have you made of that kind of response?
I thought it's been stomach turning, really. What you have here is a horrible tragedy of alleged murder, which has befallen a family. And yet you can almost hear people kind of rubbing their hands with, I hate to put it like that, but you can almost feel people rubbing their hands with glee as soon as they saw this, because they thought it could be folded into the culture war, because they thought, here we have something that we can use to bash people that we disagree with on questions of gender recognition reform in Scotland, or on questions of the gender debate more broadly. It almost immediately, quite prominent people in the kind of trans activist set were explicitly saying that Westminster had blood on their hands. There was a piece in The Independent, which I thought was absolutely shameful, which essentially said, we don't yet know if anti-trans hate is a part of this story. The police, it's still an area of investigation. It's not been closed, but at the same time, it's not been confirmed or reported on. But, and then it's just, we couldn't help but feel that this was coming, and that since the Tory leadership race to the gender recognition discussion to this to that, these people have blood on their hands, and this keeps happening. And I think where you basically have some sort of horrendous killing, tragedy, atrocity, whatever, and it's just very quickly weaponized, basically to the ends of, I dislike this person in public life, politics, I'm going to blame them because they've expressed a reasonable concern that vaguely relates to this issue. The fact that in this case, again, no kind of anti-trans hate component has been located hasn't stopped it in any way, shape or form, which makes it even more shameless. But at the same time, I think it also just speaks to the fact that it almost everything gets swallowed up by the culture, or even these kind of very particular human tragedies. There's no restraint. And obviously, when we talk about the culture, well, a lot of important issues are bound up in that. But I guess what I'm getting at is to say that there's a lot of discussion these days about how people weaponize certain issues, about the mean-spiritedness of, say, our side of a lot of these discussions and so on. But I see no equivalent in mainstream political discourse to the sort of behaviour that we've seen in recent days when it comes to this, to people who, as soon as they see an atrocity like this, just their almost immediate reaction is to use a dead body as a soapbox, and that is deeply unpleasant. And I think people should be called out for doing that.
And it's come offline as well. I mean, we can look at a clip now of people at a vigil for Brianna Ghey making their feelings known about Keir Starmer.
Fuck Keir Starmer! Fuck Keir Starmer!
Essentially, Ella, Keir Starmer is being accused of having blood on his hands because he's not completely 100% on board with self-ID for 16-year-olds. I mean, what does that say about the kind of level of debate where things have, how low have things sunk?
And it's also, I mean, he's also been accused of being complicit because he hadn't at that point in the vigil said anything about the alleged murder of Brianna Ghey. And it's it has echoes of the whole kind of silence is violence argument from the murder of George Floyd. In fact, actually, a lot of the some of the signs and some of the chants at that vigil were very similar. So there was a kind of lots of people saying, say her name, which was something that came out of a kind of Black Lives Matter movement around some of the police killings in America. And it's just so incredibly unspecific. There is nothing really, as I can see it, that would obviously have the proviso that we don't know anything, but it seems bizarre that you would find a link between the killing of George Floyd and the killing of this trans school teenager. And, there's something, as Tom says, really sort of worrying about it and really distasteful. I mean, on a human level, this is a child that's been killed, and parents who don't have their child anymore, and that's a terrible thing. And there's been this sort of a row online about how this is being reported, and obviously the family want to stay true to how Brianna described herself and called herself. They use she, her pronouns and all that kind of thing. But at the same time, there is this sort of slight difficulty with, I was listening to the radio and it was reported that a schoolgirl had been killed, and obviously that's inaccurate. And so it's one of those, issues that I think most sensible people say, okay, let's not have our kind of Twitter row about pronouns. Let's not have our Twitter row about or about kind of gender reform bill. Someone's been killed, but as Tom says, some people never rest, and there is just it can be incredibly sort of difficult to find yourself constantly defending yourself as a good person when you're, a commentator who's talking about, or someone, anyone who thinks that very normal things that, people should be able to live however they want to live and respectfully and with freedom and all the rest of it, but just not pretend that sex isn't real, it's like you're sort of begging, just let me sort of, I'll give you everything you want, but just let me stay in reality here. I think we really have to be careful to not let the sort of demonization of the, I want to say not gender critical side, just the sort of the side of most people whose heart breaks for that family, but at the same time is not going to be cowed into silence on the base. And we've had this, similarly with sort of, the whole kind of argument around suicide rates of trans people. And, it basically what it boils down to is shut up or we'll claim that you are murderous and have blood on your hands. Moving forward, any kind of broader discussions about the gender wars, I don't think should be cowed by incidents like this.
Yeah, it essentially seems that, as we were talking about in Scotland earlier, the kind of gender ideology argument has been pretty comprehensively trashed when it's been discussed rationally, when it's been discussed in the courts or in sort of parliamentary settings, when it's discussed at the higher political level. So now we have to turn to this kind of emotional blackmail almost. That seems to be is that why they've leapt on it with such glee? I think
that's part, and even just moving away from this particular tragedy as well, I think you do start to see some of the more prominent people on the other side of this argument are becoming increasingly over the top and true. I mean, even with Nicola Sturgeon, we saw a kind of example of this where when she was really on the back foot, when, again, she was kind of dealing with brickbats left, right and centre, when her whole argument on authority was unravelling. She does the basket of deplorables thing. She calls everyone, they're not just transphobes, they're often homophobic. Some of them are even racist. There's a certain individual I won't name who's been going around recently likening gender critical women to the KKK because they're also people who protect women, was their, again, in their case, much more devious kind of, way of prosecuting their particular bigoted argument. These are not arguments you make when you're winning. These are not shameful tactics that you deploy if you're actually, on the right side of history, and most people in the country recognise this. So I think the more, as you suggest, that the gender ideology argument is kind of defeated in public or has certain setbacks at least, the lower some of the more prominent activists in this tend to sink. But I think it might again shame some people into keeping quiet on certain things here or there, and that's regrettable. But I think in general, it just continues to display that for all their claims to be incredibly morally virtuous, that's not really what's going on here with this particular campaign.
And one thing it is worth pointing out the fact that, tragedies like the Brianna Ghey one are mercifully rare. It's good news that there isn't mass killings of trans people, as is often claimed. In fact, before Brianna Ghey, the last trans person in Great Britain to be killed was in 2019. Roughly, if you take into account the size of the trans population, a regular, everyday person is slightly more likely to be murdered. So, these claims of victimhood seem to be all that there is, in a sense. That seems to be the argument. Trans people suffer, therefore we must bend reality to it, and it's not appropriate.
Well, a similar thing happened when Sarah Everard was murdered, which is that there's a real tendency, a kind of macabre tendency to jump on something, an incident that happens like that, and extrapolate from it to try and make some kind of broader political and moral point. The first thing I thought when I heard it is, allegedly that you potentially have the situation in which kids are killing each other. What's going on there? That's for a whole nother podcast. But there's, and then the same thing happened with the Sarah Everard murder. There was this kind of huge discussion about sort of women's safety and broad, allegations made about patriarchy and misogyny, and then it turns out to be a very specific case of a specific police officer, and actually kind of discussions about consent classes had absolutely nothing to do with it. Who knows whether that will be the case here? We wait to see what the police find out, but they're just you should be ashamed of yourself if you think that there is political sort of battles to be won off the back of people being killed, particularly when we don't know anything yet.
And finally, let's talk about the unrest in Knowsley in Merseyside. So around 400 people turned up to protest outside a hotel that was hosting asylum seekers. And within a few hours, things started to turn ugly. A few people turned up with hammers, with fireworks, essentially started rioting, set fire to a police car. A couple of people were injured. 15 people have been arrested. I suppose similar to the last story, immediately the blame game began, and it's all apparently Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary's fault. What did you make of that?
I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, Knowsley, as far as I understand it, to call it a Labour stronghold is putting it lightly. I think about 80% Labour vote at the last general election. These are numbers that make Kim Jong-un sort of, blush. To suggest that people in Merseyside are going home and just listening endlessly to interviews with Suella Braverman, hanging on her every word, seems strange to say the least. But again, it's just that kind of reflex, which is something unpleasant happens, and how can we pin it on our political enemies? And then the other thing which seems to happen is this kind of reflexive desire to, again, kind of ignore any of the kind of problems that this particular case has arisen. There's some discussion of it, but it was very quickly painted as basically just a far-right protest. even though even Hope Not Hate have pointed out that this seem to be kind of organically a lot of women and children, which then got kind of hijacked by thugs later on in the night.
Yeah.
Thugs who actually didn't seem to be kind of outside agitators, but actually lived locally. Lord knows what their motivations is. I'm sure we'll find out in time. But a kind of refusal to believe that there are particular problems with the failing asylum system that we have, which is both failing the people caught up in it as well as the communities who are finding, again, kind of being made to basically bear the brunt of government incompetence on this particular question. Knowsley is a kind of archetypal example insofar as it's a very deprived local authority. I think it's the third most deprived in the country. About half the kids are on free school meals. And this is the sort of community in which migrant hotels, etc., tend to be.
Yeah.
They're cheaper. So there is this, there was a case like in last year, Knowsley local authority get 48 hours notice saying that we're going to take over this particular hotel. And again, rather than actually in the context of a lack of investment in a particular area, poor job prospects and so on. And also the fact that, as we know, the asylum system is creaking. This is not a successful system of finding out who legitimate asylum seekers are, integrating them into society and so on. It's really not working. So when there are these kind of flare-ups, rather than trying to address what are some of the legitimate concerns, obviously this was sparked by a particular encounter, alleged encounter between a 15-year-old girl and a 25-year-old seemingly asylum seeker, propositioning her. That was immediately dismissed as just misinformation, even though it's something that Liverpool Echo have reported on, that the police are investigating because there are eyewitnesses to it and so on. We don't know what really went on there. That's obviously not, that should never be the pretext to suggest that all asylum seekers are a risk to young girls or women or whatever. But again, the kind of just reflexive, this is just far right misinformation, these people are just getting stirred up. The refusal to really look at, it's in a weird sort of way lets the government off the hook. It almost just sort of says the problem here is the mob rather than the obvious failings of this particular system. But, once again, you just see the willingness just to look past the details, use it as an opportunity to either have a knock at the Tories or have a knock at white working class people.
Yeah.
That's always what they prefer to take, it seems like, in terms of the commentary.
And Ella, Tom was talking there about the video. It was... We have no idea whether it's true or not, but rather than saying this was unverified or something like that, it was immediately cast as misinformation. Potentially, what happens to sort of believe women? That seems to go out the window of these kinds of cases. I'm not saying we should necessarily believe everything we see on the internet.
No, but the thing about we shouldn't always believe everything on the internet. We're always told by that. We're always by these kind of, by a liberal sort of commentariat who say, social media is full of misinformation. You're all idiots. All you do is, react to stuff that isn't true that you see. And then, I was doing a paper review the morning after the events took place in Knowsley and had all these headlines from the Guardian and the Independent and was basically saying far right protests, and I was like struggling with the story, thinking, they had a line in it that said, well, patriotic allegiance or alliance, whatever they're called, the alternative. They're set up by BNP founders, have said that they're nothing to do with it. And I said, okay, so who is? And you're struggling to find it and couldn't.
I think they were leafleting in the area or something.
Yeah, and couldn't actually find out what had actually happened, even though I was reading news reports. And Tom's right. It's ridiculous to say that Suella Braverman is to blame, but there definitely the government holds a lot of blame because there is this sort of unsustainable policy of basically without any kind of democratic cooperation with people living in a particular area, with no respect for kind of community sensibilities. And by that, I don't mean, these people are a bit anti-immigrant, we shouldn't put them there. And that's not true. I mean, genuinely looking at resources in a community, and saying, is this sort of feasible to, in one of the poorest areas in the UK, suddenly bring a load more people to live here? The government just seems to be completely willfully blind to all that kind of thing. There's similar things happening in Ireland at the moment, actually, where there's a sort of local area where there's been big plans for in Blessington, which is in County Wicklow, for a sort of sports, planning permission in Ireland is hellish. And there's been years of planning into this, getting a sports centre and a pool and all the rest of it. And, very, very quickly it's whipped away and is suddenly now going to be housing for refugees, and they're Ukrainian refugees. And, then the Irish government is shocked when people get a bit pissed off and that kind of thing. And a similar thing is happening in European countries where without any consultation with citizens or any kind of democratic discussion, even at the level of sort of, parliamentary debate, that there is no agreement that this is a thing that people want. And even for, people who want to see a more liberal immigration system, this sort of basically process of having little to no understanding of how the asylum system works, of the basic, even for the asylum seekers themselves, facing living in these hotels for months, if not years, because their file's been lost by some kind of Home Office civil servant. None of it works, and so it's no wonder that people get a bit pissed off.
I think it's telling that actually no one really is actually making a pro-immigration case. They're saying their case is basically, you're racist, stop talking about it. And that's it. Whether it's the small boats crisis, whether it's the asylum crisis, it is clearly not a good thing to have 47,000 people then put into hotels who are not allowed to do anything all day. It's not a good way to manage things, but you're not allowed to just talk about it. The only people that want to talk about it, seemingly, are maybe people who have bad intentions.
We have an incredibly stringent immigration system in terms of the points-based system, which basically blocks the working class of the world from coming, because you have to have a PhD and all other kinds of things to be able to come and work and live and work in this country. And yet there seems to be an unending, and this is where you start to sound like sort of anti-immigrant person, even though, I think we should have a more liberal approach to it, which is that you have this, people look at the number of people that are put up in hotels, the approach to the kind of small boat system, and say, hang on a minute, like, what's going on here? There's just a feeling of a lack of control. And what so many people mistake the Brexit vote for as this sort of anti-immigrant expulsion of kind of bile was actually an expression of, can we have some kind of system of control here? We want to, having sovereignty, and national sovereignty means being able to know and control, how many people are living in a nation. And you can, once you have that control and once you understand that and you've got a grip on it, then you can come along and make the case for a more open system, or, a more liberal system. But at the moment, it just looks like, to your average person, like, Suella Braverman and the rest of them don't know what's going on, haven't a clue. And as you say, the only argument in town is shut up about it.
And it's like the failures get pushed along the line as well, because I completely agree. I think the prerequisite for a more liberal immigration system, a more generous asylum policy and so on, is control. The idea that the state has got a grip on this. And, if you think about the hotels and the small boats problem, the fact that tens of thousands of people are making an incredibly dangerous crossing, and that, again, when they arrive in Britain, we don't necessarily know who they are. It's very difficult to kind of maintain any kind of safety checks. There have been, mercifully rare, but there have been kind of cases of former asylum seekers who go on to commit some heinous acts and so on. And people are going to be upset about that. It's ludicrous to suggest otherwise. But what you have, because there's that lack of control over the border, the problem then gets pushed down the line. We'll just stick them in hotels. They can't do anything. They can't work. They can't do this. They can't do that.
It's crap for them as well.
Exactly. And it's the sort of thing where, and again, because of the fact that when you do have such a dysfunctional system as of this, it is going to lead, and a dysfunctional system which is going to kind of breed a certain level of resentment, also piled on top of the fact that the way in which disproportionately impoverished areas are being made to bear the brunt of this, even though they're starved of resources in so many ways. As soon as anyone kind of points out some of the cracks, they're accused of racism or being some sort of troublemaker. And, we're relatively lucky, the fact that the far right in this country is a pathetic sort of tiny group of people. You know what I mean? And that's something that is something that we shouldn't take for granted, though, because you'd never want to be in a situation where the only people willing to talk about certain things are the ones that, as you say, have nefarious intentions.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.